There are two ways of looking at animated film, to emphasize the animated aspect of it or the film aspect of it. I think in the US the tendency is to evaluate it as animation, and I think in Japan the tendency is to put the emphasis on the film part. And it's filmmaking first, animation second.
I mean, I was always a fan of anime. When Akira came out, I thought it was fantastic. But the boys opened my eyes to it. The Wachowski brothers showed me Ghost in the Shell, and they showed me what they wanted to do with that type of action and photography and try to make it with real people, with real actors, and create a hybrid.
表現の方法としても日本の漫画で、よく使われるカッティングであるとか絵作り、アニメーションの中で使われる演出、香港のワイヤーアクションの、独特な世界観、こういったですね世界中のあらゆるさまざまな映像の素材というのをかなり高い次元で融合させて、それをなおかつライブアクションでやってしまったというのがですね非常に衝撃でした。アニメーションを見てるような感覚で見ていましたね。
It seemed like they were animating their actors the way an animator would manipulate an animated character.
やっぱりそのカット割りだとかね、そういうとこで自分もよくやるようなカット割り、と似てるなとかっていうふうには思ったんだけど、やっぱり実写でやるとそれが全然味わいが違っちゃうし、やっぱ実写でここまでやられちゃったら俺ら次にどうやって使ったらすごい映像作れるかなっていうところがやっぱり非常に、不安にもさせてくれたね、
それを見せられたらまたそれに負けないような映像を作りたいなっていう風な、意欲も湧いてくるし、いろんな意味で、影響あった作品と思います。
I remember somebody said to me, the movie is so Japanese. And then I remember when I was in Spain, they said, the movie is so Spanish. But I, of course, think it's very Jewish, but that's where I'm from. We went to Japan in September of '99 after the movie opened to do a Japanese press junket.
ラリー&アンディがですね日本に来た時に彼らが見たい場所というのがテレビゲームの開発会社の、スタジオの中を見たい。
At the same time, meet all the Japanese anime directors and all the entities that do the Japanese anime because they were fans and we were trying to figure out a way to use it.
当然そのアイディアも非常にたくさんのさまざまなアイデアも浮かぶんですが、何よりもその日本のですねこういった漫画であるとかアニメーションであるとかフィギュアであるとかそういったポップカルチャーの部分をとてもよく日本人以上に研究して知り尽くしていると。
We found this terrific talent, a very talented guy named Mike Arias, who was actually a friend of John Gata, who was our head of visual effects on Matrix movies. And we met Mike, and he is an American guy living in Japan.
I took him over to Studio 4 Degrees, which is where we've ended up doing most of the Animatrix.
これはね、すごく記念すべき、私にもすごい楽しい話なんだけれども、マトリックスを公開するときにジョエル・シルバーさんとアンディ・ラリー・ウォシャクスキーさんがアロハシャツで、それでサンダル履きでペタペタペタっとこのスタジオに遊びに来てくれたんですね。
I think they were just really feeling the situation out.
We had the opportunity to really incorporate traditional anime in some fashion that would incorporate elements of the story in a new way. And we didn't know how to do it at first. We thought maybe we'd do a television show. We thought maybe we might do one anime feature.
I ended up spending the whole week with these guys and seeing The Matrix for the first time at the Japanese premiere. And, I was blown away too. It was very... who are these guys? Where did they come from? And how did John Gata pull this off? Like a total slacker.
I remember on the plane ride back, Larry sat down with a yellow pad and kind of mapped out this scheme that we would do where we would have the movie and a video game and these animated stories and how they would all kind of interact together. And we made the decision to do a series of 9 or 10 short animated tales, yarns that would be in and around the Matrix.
When we first started, it was very much 10 6-minute episodes. Now it's like 9 episodes and they're anywhere between 6 minutes and 16 minutes.
The boys and I wanted to direct these episodes. They wanted to find high-end Japanese animation directors who could bring to the table their own style and their own ideas. The brothers wrote 4 of the episodes themselves and collaborated with the directors on the other episodes.
I've been very impressed by how open they are to other people's ideas.
They really wanted to give them the freedom to make these stories their own. And I think they did that because they're all coming from the same place, but they approach it all so differently.
今までですね、これ日本だけではなく海外も含めてこれだけビッグでこれだけの監督さんたちを一堂に集めたプロジェクトというのはありませんでした。
Larry and Andy appreciate the history of Japanese anime. They revel in it. They love animation. So Japanese anime is probably one of the most significant influences on them and on these movies. I mean, Japanese anime is not a new thing. I mean, it's been around forever.
The modern Japanese comic is a fusion of two things. It's a fusion of Western form, which is basically the grammar for modern comic books, which was developed in the United States. That was fused onto an indigenous tradition. It goes back hundreds, even 1,000 years, of art that entertains, and it's mainly line art.
That manga are really an outgrowth or just the sort of modern expression of the same artistic vibes that inspired the great ukiyo-e, the Japanese woodblock printmakers of the 19th and 18th centuries, and even before that, the old Buddhist scroll makers.
You'd unroll them from right to left, and as you unrolled them, there would be a story that would unfold. And then later on, you had the emergence of woodblock prints, which were a way to mass-produce visual art, and they depicted more popular subjects, often such as kabuki actors, natural scenes, but they were also compiled into books and used to tell stories in sequence, so they were very similar to today's comics in many senses.
But then they, in the 1920s, I think it was, they discovered the funnies in America. They started drawing, story comics as opposed to these one-panel things.
All the forms of Japan anime out there, you have this constant interest in history. Many of the primary works are historically based. So it becomes a reflection of history and a reflection on history. And all of this comes out of a greater search for identity at the heart of all this work. Anime rose directly out of the post-war situation in Japan after World War II, specifically out of manga comics.
I think there are a lot of reasons that comic book culture, manga culture exploded after the war. One of them, I think, had to do with the pent-up demand for entertainment, because people had been living under a lot of privation and they'd been suffering a lot.
Most of the theaters in metropolitan Japan were gone. Movies might be displayed on a white wall of a building with chairs laid outside. The Japanese movie industry in the late 40s was virtually non-existent.
There were some artists who appeared at this time. The most famous one of all is Osamu Tezuka, who is regarded as the sort of god of manga and anime. He took the American comic book format and he started experimenting with it, and he developed a much more visually oriented style that drove the kids wild in Japan.
You would have action that would just kind of leak into the next panel and then permeate the next one, so your eye is kind of traveling at a faster rate.
He took many of the things that he saw in Disney animation or even Max Fleischer animation, and many of those elements, and tried to sort of replicate them on the physical page. And as a result, many of his early characters look very much like Max Fleischer characters and even early Disney characters. At the beginning of the 50s on, the kids who were reading manga kept reading them as they aged, and the industry increasingly targeted them, and the market expanded and expanded.
And now, any genre you'll find in literature. Hard-boiled detective, sappy love stories, science fiction, fantasy tales, straight adventure stories, stories about everyday life.
They put every subject matter into comic books. We have a tendency here to think that, if it's not Archie comics or superhero comic books, well, what could it possibly be?
They're manga about, loan sharks. They're manga about housewives. They're mangas about, people who are unemployed, office workers.
There's mahjong ones, right? And then you have a grappler fighting one.
Some are for females and some are for males. It's broken up that way, but then there's ones for kids, ones for adults, ones for perverts.
All these topics that you wouldn't imagine are popular, but everybody reads them.
manga are a true mass medium. And when Americans and Europeans look at manga, one of the problems they have is they're often viewing them in the context of comic books, which are such a mini market in the United States.
You can go on the subway in Japan and you'll see anybody from 6 to 60 sitting there, huddled tightly against the other people reading their book, and nobody looks down at them, which I find always amusing here because, the same people that throw their nose up at you going, oh, you mean comic book, are the same people who go to action movies up to the age of 50. You go, action movies are just comic books, really, when you get right down to it.
So it's a huge industry, and it's a huge part of Japanese culture that's hard for people outside of Japan to understand.
It really began what we think of as anime with Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy. That was a Pinocchio story.
Tezuka put together a production studio to create a TV animation. So he created the first Japanese black and white TV animation in 1963 and followed that very quickly with the first full color animation series, which we know in the United States is Kimba the White Lion.
Early animation in every country has to cut corners like any commercial product. You have to do things in a way that meets your budget. So Tezuka developed a marvelous sequence of things which would give an impression of motion and action and things.
Which now we call limited animation. The more drawings you have in a second, the smoother the action will look. So they've come up with all kinds of ways to limit the amount of time for which smooth motion has to be created as a way of lowering the production costs.
And you might have a very large drawing and the camera might physically pan over this one drawing. You have motion as the camera pans over the drawing. You don't have a huge number of cells painted by people.
かなり短期間に作るということですよね。ローバジェットで短期間に作ることには長けてると思います。
That's the one thing that the Japanese do way grander than us, is that they figured out how to cheat your way, if you will, through the process, and in the good moments actually convince you that they weren't cheating.
It often looks just like reading manga. Often the frames are semi-frozen. The characters don't move as rapidly as, say, Disney animation.
And you find poses and angles from which the characters look good, and you play to those and use dialogue and cutting and the settings more than an American director might.
If you slide static images, it looks like things are moving because the perspective of your eye changes as you come up over a hill. And as you turn a corner, everything moves on you. So if you move something in the background and you move the people in the middle ground and everything's going like this at a different rate, you see motion. Motion equals animation.
There's more emphasis on close-ups of faces, sort of freezing of the frame where you're focusing on the eyes and the emotion. A lot of Americans look at Japanese animation and Japanese comics and they are sort of puzzled by the look of the characters. They often have big eyes and they often look Caucasian, and that's partly due to some of the techniques that Tezuka established. His model was really American animation.
These anime babes, they have the same big eyes, the same voluptuous figure, and they're cute and bouncy and speaking squeaky little voices just like Betty Boop.
Where did she come from?
There's cross-pollination there, I think it's somewhat similar. I mean, Astro Boy has 2 points on his head, like Mickey Mouse had 2 ears.
One tip-off watching a Japanese film is if the character has large eyes, he or she is probably on the good side. If they've got small eyes, they are probably not, because they're not sensitive. It's very much the windows of the soul.
It's nothing to do with Japan at all. It's just a convention that was established.
It's anime style.
You get sequences in which there seems to be very little action going on. They have these beautiful slow moments that are very atmospheric because they want to.
Historically in Japan, there's been this emphasis on the non-stated, on the vacuum space, and on the frozen element. So even in Japanese novels, there's a lot of emphasis on implied meaning. And part of that comes out of the language. This Japanese language relies so heavily on implied meaning. There are many things that are not directly stated.
引き算ですね。そうアメリカの方が足し算だとすると日本のそういうものの表現ってなんか伝統的に引き算がかっこいいみたいなところがあると思うんですよね。言い過ぎはかっこよくないとか。
I kind of regard the individual drawings in an animated film almost like brush strokes in a painting, and traditional Western art is interested in creating an illusion of nature, whereas traditional Eastern painting is more about the gesture of the painter.
And they use a lot of speed lines and motion, and they just want you to believe that that guy's running a million miles an hour, that guy's flying. We're here, when you do Spider-Man, we have a tendency in Superman to show the building behind them to still create the illusion, and we don't necessarily have the confidence maybe in our audience that, we established them jumping out of the building 2 panels ago, that they're still flying. We don't have to show it every panel.
Hizo tráilers. Visita mi canal.
One of the delicious tropes of anime, which I think is a direct influence on The Matrix, is this savory anticipation before the violence erupts. You get this kind of freeze frame in action, this pause, right before there's often extreme violence or a moment of great action. It's a dramatic pause. You're propelled along, and then you abruptly stop. The sound will even drop out. And then, because you already have this fluidity between foreground and background, you can get these crazy things and this zoom in. Slowing up of time, or of this incredible pan, or the camera moving through space. It's like not only are you stopping before it happens and looking at it, but you're going to walk around it and see it from a million different points of view, and do a close-up of that bit of horror, just before, when it's got a psychic effect instead of a physical effect.
As the economy continued to grow and that industry continued to expand, they just moved out in all directions into a variety of graphic styles, to the use of color, development of features, of direct-to-video projects, and of broadcast television projects, and produced an extraordinary body of work during the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
By the time mid-60s had come along, the anime had started to flow into this country with stuff like Speed Racer. By the time Battleship Yamato and G-Force and that stuff started coming in, American productions just seemed tame by comparison.
In the 70s, some people start noticing that this is something else.
It started out very small. The first organized clubs were an offshoot of science fiction fandom.
Thing that was the exclusive preserve of a very small group of geeks who watched bootleg tapes or films in Japanese when very often they didn't speak Japanese.
By the 80s, you have this huge fanboy subculture.
And in the late 80s, you had things like Akira being done. When it made the art house theaters in the US, it really had an impact. For a lot of Americans, for a long time, if you mentioned anime, they would think Akira.
Anyone who was into action movies saw that and was like, wow, they can only be blown away by that.
You can say that Akira is a story of post-apocalyptic Japan, but the fact is that Japanese society itself is post-apocalyptic. I mean, Japan had atom bombs dropped on it, and I really think that influences every art movement that you see in Japan after the war. I mean, it's all post-apocalyptic.
And so having seen the apocalypse up close, I think that's just an important element in their psychology and something that they cannot help but be aware of.
The first frame of Akira is the mushroom cloud.
Fandom really expanded dramatically in the 90s with the growth of college clubs.
College theaters got a hold of those films and just played them over and over and over. They became midnight things. When I was in college, Akira and Ghost of the Shell played forever.
People would trade tapes with their own subtitles added on.
Maybe embarrassed to have tape sometimes.
Yeah.
It's like an embarrassing thing, It's really closeted. But some people we know started off trading tapes, maybe having bootleg tapes, and then they went on to open up their own stores, legitimate stores. So it's kind of like the way rappers used to sell stuff out of their trunk.
Late 80s, early 90s, you have this huge explosion. It's still not entirely mainstream, but you have Time yeah, it is mainstream. You have Time magazine doing stories on Japanime.
The introduction of Japanese animation on video, which is now a $500 million a year industry in this country. The increased broadcasting of Japanese programs on TV.
Now you can get it at major chains and stuff. And there'll be anime sections and huge tech stores. And it shows up in commercials and big movies now.
And that's sort of a moment which allows the inclusiveness of Matrix.
This is a Japanese product, and yet it's causing Americans to get together, Americans to connect with each other in a very, I think, very positive way.
Maybe that's our hope here, is that it's here, that it's the next generation that will go, no, that's equally as good, if not better, and we grew up with it. We accept, outside culture sort of ideas, and maybe that's how we have to get that thing going from a trickle to a full-blown flood. That'd actually be nice.
In the United States, we've built all these little fences around animation and said, essentially, the medium can't go here. That certain sorts of violent actions, certain kinds of relationships, sexual activities, intellectual content just aren't appropriate for animation in this country. In Japan, none of those boundaries exist.
日本のやつはよりその世界観とかムードとか、あとそのお話ですよね。日本のアニメってのはその映画ではなくて漫画でもなくて絵物語と映画のちょっと間ぐらいのところにあるような気がするんですよね。だからその
Like garage rock, it works as long as there's soul behind it.